For 4 decades, a killer believed he had escaped justice. He grew older. He celebrated birthdays. He watched Sacramento change around him. Neighbors waved as he walked by. Friends saw nothing unusual. No one suspected that behind an ordinary life was a secret buried since the spring of 1980. He thought time had erased every trace. He thought witnesses had forgotten. He thought detectives had moved on. He thought the evidence could never speak. He was wrong, because hidden inside a carefully preserved evidence vault, protected from heat, light, and time itself, something had survived. Not a confession, not an eyewitness, not a forgotten diary, just a few microscopic drops of blood. Blood he never knew he had left behind. For 40 years, that blood waited patiently for science to become smart enough to reveal its owner's name. When it finally did, one of Sacramento County's oldest unsolved murders came crashing back to life. This is the story of Robin Brooks, a young woman who moved across America searching for a fresh beginning, only to become the victim of a stranger who believed he would never answer for what he had done. And it's the story of how one of the greatest revolutions in forensic science finally gave Robin a voice after 40 years of silence. Before we begin, if you enjoy deeply researched true crime documentaries that focus on real investigations, verified evidence, and the victims whose stories deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing to Cold Case Exposed. Every subscription helps us continue bringing forgotten cases back into the light. Robin Brooks was only 20 years old. Friends remembered her as thoughtful rather than loud. She wasn't the kind of person who demanded attention when she entered a room. Instead, people noticed something quieter. She listened. She remembered small details about other people's lives. She had an easy smile that made strangers feel comfortable, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone determined to build a future on her own terms. Although many official records listed her full name as Flora Robin Brooks, almost everyone simply knew her as Robin. It was the name she preferred, the name she introduced herself with, the name her friends called out whenever she walked through the door. Like many young adults, Robin wanted something new, a different city, a fresh start, an opportunity to create a life that belonged entirely to her. That opportunity appeared in California. Leaving behind much of her childhood on the East Coast, Robin moved nearly 3,000 miles west to Sacramento. It wasn't an easy decision. Starting over never is. Everything familiar disappeared overnight. New streets, new neighbors, new routines. But she wasn't completely alone. Her sister already lived in the Sacramento area, giving Robin the chance to begin again with family nearby. It wasn't a glamorous life. She rented a modest apartment at the Garden Club Apartments in the Rosemont neighborhood. Money was tight. Like many young people starting over, she worked long hours to support herself. Her job was at a neighborhood donut shop known as Donut Time. It wasn't the kind of work most people dreamed about. Late-night shifts meant working while the rest of the city slept. Fresh coffee, warm donuts, early morning customers heading to work before sunrise. It required discipline, reliability, the ability to stay cheerful even after midnight. Robin never complained. Co-workers remembered someone dependable. If she promised she'd cover a shift, she showed up. If someone needed help, she helped. She was quietly building a life that, while simple, was entirely her own. By April of 1980, she'd settled into a routine. Work, home, sleep, repeat. Her apartment sat only a short distance from Donut Time. Close enough that she usually walked. It was a route she knew well. 1 block, just a few minutes. Nothing about it seemed dangerous. The neighborhood felt ordinary. The streets were familiar. There was little reason to believe those few hundred yards would ever become the setting for one of Sacramento's longest-running murder investigations. April 23, 1980, began like any other workday. Robin prepared for another late-night shift. She had recently finished washing her bedding and joked with a coworker that she'd have to remake the bed when she got home. It was an ordinary conversation, the kind people have every single day. Small, forgettable, meaningless. Except sometimes, the most ordinary conversations become the last ones anyone remembers. No one inside Donut Time could have imagined that within hours detectives would be standing inside Robin's apartment documenting one of the most violent crime scenes the county had ever investigated. As midnight approached, customers came and went. Coffee cups were filled. Orders were handed across the counter. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing hinted that somewhere nearby, someone was about to make a decision that would change countless lives forever. Robin finished her work just after midnight. She stepped outside into the cool California night. Her walk home should have taken only a matter of minutes. She had walked that route before, dozens of times, maybe hundreds, felt routine, safe, predictable. She never knew someone was waiting. She never knew she was about to become the center of a mystery that would outlive entire generations of investigators. By the following afternoon, Robin Brooks would fail to arrive for work. Concern would quickly replace routine. Co-workers would begin asking questions. Then they would decide to check on her themselves. What they discovered behind the door of her apartment would shock even experienced investigators and launch a murder investigation that would remain unsolved for the next 40 years. In the next chapter, we'll step inside the investigation that stunned Sacramento, examine the evidence left behind at the scene, and uncover the critical mistake the killer made without even realizing it. A mistake that would eventually expose him decades later. If you're watching this story unfold, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people discover these forgotten cases and ensures that victims like Robin Brooks are never erased by time. By the afternoon of April 24, 1980, concern had begun to spread among Robin's coworkers. She wasn't the type of person who simply failed to appear for work. If she was running late, she would let someone know. If she made a commitment, she kept it. When she didn't arrive for her scheduled shift, something immediately felt wrong. At first, they tried to explain it away. Maybe she had overslept. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. Maybe something unexpected had come up. But as the hours passed, those explanations became harder to believe. Someone finally decided to check on her apartment. It was only a short distance away. The walk that Robin had made countless times now felt strangely different. There was no reason to expect what waited behind that apartment door. The moment they realized something was terribly wrong, authorities were called. Within minutes, deputies from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department arrived and secured the scene. Experienced investigators quickly recognized they were looking at far more than a routine homicide. Every room reflected signs of a desperate struggle. Furniture had been displaced. Personal belongings lay scattered. Objects that should have remained untouched were out of place. Nothing suggested that Robin had quietly accepted the attack. Every indication pointed to someone who fought with everything she had. For crime scene investigators, every disturbance told part of the story. Each overturned object, each damaged surface, each drop of blood became another silent witness. Although the apartment showed evidence of violence, one detail immediately stood out. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Money remained. Personal belongings were still present. Jewelry had not disappeared. There was no obvious sign that the attacker had entered simply to commit a burglary. That changed the entire direction of the investigation. If robbery wasn't the motive, what was? Medical examiners later confirmed that Robin had suffered a violent assault before her death. The injuries revealed a sustained attack, one that investigators believed escalated inside the apartment rather than ending quickly. But amid the tragedy, detectives discovered something that would quietly become the most important piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Robin had fought back. She had not surrendered. She resisted. She defended herself. And during that struggle, her attacker made a mistake. Investigators located blood that did not belong to Robin. At first glance, it seemed almost insignificant, just small stains left behind during the violence. But laboratory testing confirmed something remarkable. The blood came from another person. Somewhere during the attack, the killer had apparently injured himself. Perhaps his hand slipped. Perhaps broken glass or another sharp object caused the wound. Whatever happened, he unknowingly left part of himself behind. In 1980, that discovery filled detectives with optimism. They believed biological evidence would eventually identify the killer. Unfortunately, science wasn't yet capable of delivering the answers they needed. DNA profiling did not exist as investigators know it today. Instead, forensic laboratories relied on blood typing. Blood typing was useful, but only to a point. It could eliminate people whose blood type clearly didn't match. What it couldn't do was identify one individual out of millions who shared the same characteristics. Detectives suddenly found themselves holding valuable evidence, without possessing the technology needed to fully use it. Still, they refused to give up. Investigators interviewed family members, friends, neighbors, co-workers, anyone who might have crossed paths with Robin during her final weeks. Every conversation was carefully documented, every timeline reconstructed, every possible lead explored. One question kept returning. Did Robin know the person who attacked her? Or had she become the victim of a complete stranger? At first, detectives naturally focused on those closest to her. Statistics suggested that many violent crimes involved someone already known to the victim. Family members cooperated fully. Friends answered difficult questions. Individuals connected to Robin's daily life voluntarily provided information in hopes of helping investigators move the case forward. Each interview ruled out another possibility. Each laboratory report eliminated another name. Weeks turned into months. The investigation expanded beyond Sacramento. Tips arrived from different parts of California. Some sounded promising. Others quickly fell apart after basic investigation. Even so, detectives followed every credible lead. No matter how unlikely it appeared, Robin's family refused to let her be forgotten. They publicly appealed for information. A reward was offered for anyone who could provide information leading investigators to the person responsible. Newspaper articles kept the case in public view. Television reports reminded viewers that a young woman had been murdered inside her own home. Calls continued coming in, some anonymous, some sincere, some completely false. Everyone had to be investigated. Yet each time detectives believed they were getting closer, the trail disappeared. The evidence remained. The answers did not. Months became years. Boxes of reports slowly filled filing cabinets. Photographs were carefully preserved. Fingerprint cards remained cataloged. Blood samples stayed locked inside secure storage. Many investigations lose critical evidence over time. Labels fade. Records disappear. Materials deteriorate. Fortunately, that didn't happen here. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department maintained the physical evidence with extraordinary care. No one knew it then, but that decision would eventually become one of the most important reasons this case would one day be solved. The investigators working in 1980 couldn't have imagined the scientific advances that were still decades away. They believed they had reached the limits of available forensic technology. In reality, they had simply reached the limits of their era. The evidence wasn't failing them. Science simply hadn't caught up yet. For Robin's loved ones, however, those distinctions offered little comfort. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Another year. Then another. Every unanswered anniversary became another painful reminder that someone responsible for taking Robin's life remained free. Somewhere, that person woke up every morning believing he had escaped justice forever. The investigation had stalled, but the evidence never stopped waiting. In the next chapter, we'll explore how a revolution in forensic science breathed new life into a case many believed would never be solved, and how one forgotten piece of evidence changed everything. If you're enjoying this documentary, don't forget to subscribe to Cold Case Exposed, give this video a like, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue telling the stories of victims whose cases deserve to be remembered, not forgotten. Investigators waited. Days passed, then weeks. The results finally arrived. There was no match. It was another crushing disappointment. Whoever had murdered Robin had apparently never provided DNA to the criminal justice system through a qualifying conviction. Once again, the investigation stood still. Many cases would have ended there. Robin's did not, because science continued moving forward. Across the country, Millions of people had begun using consumer DNA testing to learn about their ancestry. Most simply wanted to discover where their families came from. Others hoped to reconnect with distant relatives. Few realized that, in doing so, they were creating entirely new possibilities for criminal investigations. This emerging technique became known as investigative genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for the suspect directly, investigators searched for relatives. Even distant cousins could provide the first clues toward identifying someone whose own DNA had never appeared in a criminal database. It was painstaking work. Unlike television dramas, there was no computer that instantly displayed the killer's name. Researchers built enormous family trees, birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, military records, census documents. Every branch had to be verified, every generation traced. Families expanded across decades. Names changed through marriage. Relatives scattered across the country. Thousands of records slowly formed one enormous puzzle. One branch at a time, the list of possibilities became smaller. Eventually, investigators found themselves focusing on one particular family. Within that family, one individual stood out. His age matched. His location matched. Most importantly, he had lived in Sacramento during the spring of 1980. His name was Philip Lee Wilson. Detectives resisted the temptation to celebrate. A genealogical lead is not proof. Points investigators in the right direction. Nothing more. Everything still had to be confirmed using traditional forensic methods. Rather than confronting Wilson immediately, investigators quietly began watching. Surveillance teams observed his daily routine. They learned where he went, where he lived, how he moved through his ordinary life. To everyone around him, Philip Lee Wilson appeared unremarkable. A man in his 70s, living quietly, going about his business. No dramatic attempts to flee. No signs that he knew investigators were watching. Meanwhile, detectives waited for something extremely ordinary. Something most people never think twice about. A discarded item. A drink container. Tissue. Anything carrying biological material that had been abandoned. When the opportunity finally arrived, investigators legally collected the discarded evidence and submitted it for laboratory testing. Then came another wait. Forensic scientists compared the newly collected DNA with the biological evidence preserved from Robin's apartment more than 40 years earlier. Every marker was examined. Every comparison repeated. The conclusion was unmistakable. The DNA matched. The blood left inside Robin's apartment belonged to Philip Lee Wilson. The biological evidence recovered from the sexual assault also matched him. Two independent pieces of evidence. One individual. The probability of another unrelated person sharing that exact profile was astronomically small. Detectives weren't finished. They revisited another critical piece of evidence collected back in 1980. Fingerprints. Those impressions had remained preserved for decades, just like the biological evidence. Modern comparison techniques produced the same answer. The fingerprints were consistent with Wilson as well. DNA. Fingerprints. Location. Timeline. The case investigators had spent decades building was finally complete. 40 years after Robin Brooks lost her life, the evidence had finally spoken. The man who believed time had erased his crime had no idea that detectives were already preparing the next chapter of his story. An arrest. After 40 years, investigators finally knew who they were looking for. But identifying a suspect is only part of the journey. In the final chapter, we'll follow the arrest, the courtroom battle, and the emotional verdict that finally brought justice to Robin Brooks and her family. If you've stayed with us this far, thank you. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Exposed, and share it with someone who appreciates real investigative stories. Every interaction helps preserve the memory of victims whose voices deserve to be heard long after the headlines fade. For nearly 40 years, Philip Lee Wilson had lived as though the past no longer existed. The investigation had faded from newspaper headlines. Detectives had retired. Neighbors came and went. Entire subdivisions changed. Yet the evidence collected inside Robin Brooks' apartment had remained exactly where investigators left it. Waiting. Now, the waiting was over. With DNA, fingerprint evidence, and the results of months of careful investigation pointing to the same man, detectives prepared to make their move. They knew surprises could jeopardize years of work. Everything had to be methodical. Everything had to be documented. On April 24, 2020, exactly 40 years after Robin's body had been discovered, investigators arrived to arrest Philip Lee Wilson. The timing was more than symbolic. It was a reminder that while justice can be delayed, it is not always denied. Wilson was taken into custody without the dramatic chase many people associate with murder investigations. There were no flashing helicopters, no televised standoff. Instead, the arrest reflected the quiet certainty of a case built on evidence rather than speculation. After 40 years, detectives no longer needed guesses. They had facts. As news of the arrest spread across Sacramento, reactions came quickly. For many residents, Robin's murder had become one of those cases people assumed would never be solved. It belonged to another era, another generation. Now suddenly it was back in the headlines. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers revisited the events of April 1980. People who had long forgotten the case began asking the same question. How had investigators solved a murder after 4 decades? The answer wasn't luck. It wasn't a confession. It was perseverance. Detectives had refused to throw away evidence that older technology couldn't explain. Scientists had continued improving forensic methods year after year. Genetic genealogists had painstakingly reconstructed family histories using public records. Every discipline contributed a small piece. Together, those pieces revealed the identity of a man who had remained anonymous for 40 years. But an arrest alone does not determine guilt. That responsibility belongs to the courtroom. When the case finally went to trial, prosecutors presented the jury with a story supported by multiple forms of independent evidence. They explained how biological material recovered from Robin's apartment matched Wilson's DNA. They demonstrated how fingerprints collected decades earlier corresponded with his own. They walked jurors through the crime scene, showing how each piece of physical evidence fit together like parts of a single puzzle. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of events. They argued that the evidence did not necessarily establish the sequence of what had occurred inside the apartment. As with every criminal trial, the burden remained on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Jurors listened carefully. They examined photographs. They reviewed forensic testimony. They heard from investigators whose work had spanned years. At one point, reports indicated the jury struggled to reach a unanimous decision. Deliberations continued. The evidence was reviewed once again. Each juror had to decide whether the physical facts presented during the trial led to only one reasonable conclusion. Finally, the waiting ended. The jury returned a unanimous verdict. Philip Lee Wilson was found guilty of the murder of Robin Brooks. 42 years after Robin's life had been stolen, the criminal case had reached its conclusion. Weeks later, the court sentenced Wilson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Robin's family, no sentence could undo the pain of losing a daughter, a sister, a loved one whose future had been taken in a matter of minutes. Nothing could restore the birthdays she never celebrated, the dreams she never achieved, the family she never had the opportunity to build. But the verdict brought something they had spent decades searching for: answers. Robin's sister later spoke about finally feeling able to move forward after carrying the weight of unanswered questions for so many years. Her words reflected something investigators hear from families across the country. Justice cannot erase grief, but uncertainty often prolongs it. Knowing what happened, knowing who was responsible, can provide a measure of peace that years of silence never could. Robin Brooks' case also transformed the way many people viewed cold cases. It demonstrated that evidence should never be dismissed simply because today's technology cannot fully analyze it. Tomorrow's science may succeed where today's cannot. Across the United States, Law enforcement agencies have reopened hundreds of unsolved investigations using the same investigative genetic genealogy techniques that helped identify Robin's killer. Families who once believed they would never receive answers are finding renewed hope. Cases once considered impossible are being solved. Not because the crimes changed, but because science did. Robin's story is ultimately about far more than forensic breakthroughs. It is about determination. About investigators who refused to stop asking questions. About scientists who continued pushing the limits of what was possible. About a family that never stopped believing the truth mattered. And perhaps most importantly, it is about a young woman whose life deserves to be remembered for far more than the violence that ended it. Robin Brooks was 20 years old. She moved across the country with hope for the future. She worked hard. She cared about the people around her. She deserved the chance to grow older. That opportunity was stolen from her. But her story was not, because 40 years later, the evidence she unknowingly helped preserve through her courageous struggle became the voice that identified her killer. In the end, time did not protect him. Silence did not protect him. Distance did not protect him. The truth simply waited until the world finally learned how to hear it. Thank you for watching this episode of Cold Case Exposed. If Robin Brooks' story reminded you why cold cases should never be forgotten, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who values real investigative journalism. Every view helps keep the memories of victims alive and supports telling the stories that might otherwise be lost to time. And if there's a cold case you'd like us to cover next, leave its name in the comments below. Some of history's biggest mysteries remain unsolved, and your suggestion could be the next investigation we bring into the light. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, sometimes justice doesn't arrive quickly, but as Robin Brooks' case proved, the truth has a remarkable way of surviving.